Where my risk is real, where there is the risk of permanent loss, really comes more at the wealth management level. And for me, wealth management is the how to own. Within how to own, you have planning structures. So some of that will deal with legacy and family arrangement around this generational wealth. Some of it is against against creditors, specifically in the US, where litigation is a major risk. These are the sources of permanent loss of family wealth.
So you're saying, and I agree, and I think it's a topic for us, is that investing is one part of, protecting and growing your wealth. You have to think about risk management and growth, opportunities and challenge there. But equally important, and for some people maybe even more important, a lot of our clients are entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And especially those in the US are exposed to all kinds of litigation. The structure side, how do you structure things? And structure comes at different levels. There's the legal asset protection, so the trusts, the asset protection trusts, the LLCs and so on. But then there's also just the simple factor of custody. Yeah. Which institution, which jurisdiction you have your assets, you hold your assets. And I think that's what you're alluding to here.
Yeah, for me that's the starting point with any new client, for example, is people like to talk about the investment side and how we're going to make money, but a little bit less sexy, maybe more boring is kind of, and much more important in my view, at least as a starting point, is how do you own your assets currently? Yeah. Before we talk about what you currently own and what we might want to own, how do you own? And obviously then that starts with what I would call the mode number one, which is planning structure and litigation for US, specifically entrepreneurial families. Is a huge risk. I think something like 90% of civil lawsuits globally are in the US because of the way the system is structured, how incentives are lined up for people engaging in litigation, obviously. So if you don't factor for this, if you don't deal with this, there's not much point taking risk and working 100-hour weeks to try and build something on top of it if you're ending up with a foundation that is sand. Yeah. So planning structures, there's far smarter people you can probably bring on here to talk about planning structures than me, but I think the piece I often see missing is the custody piece. So the idea of building elaborate planning structures and then saying, great, now we just need to drop these assets in somewhere, so whatever is cheap and convenient and easy to use, that's going to be my custodian. Often it's not even a thought, it's just, we'll put it into this
Some
bank.
Some people immediately will be thinking of FTX right now.
Well, definitely crypto has some really,
extreme case
crypto
right
again
there.
Always is kind of like the extreme level of it, but there is definitely lessons that can translate, and I think people shouldn't become complacent. It's easy to point fingers and laugh into that space, but I think how many people truly understand their custodial relationship with whoever is holding the majority of their assets right now? Because in many ways, then this maybe comes back to our conversation on Switzerland and maybe on the financial side.
The Swiss rules and the Swiss structure is kind of unique. Even the fact that in Switzerland, us as wealth managers or portfolio managers, we actually don't custody the assets, so we're not allowed to have these omnibus account structures. We always work with banks that are properly licensed that we then have a limited power of attorney for. But then I guess to your point, it's important that that bank that you choose has a structure in terms of its balance sheet, but also has a regulatory framework around it which works. And that's where I think the Swiss framework is unique, and not just for traditional assets, also for crypto, by the way. And we can touch on that a bit, but maybe right now, because the biggest part of our clients' wealth is obviously, we do have a few clients that have a lot of Bitcoin and Ether, and but they are the exceptions, I think, still. But around traditional assets, so what's special or unique about custodying with a solid Swiss bank versus, let's say, a bank in the US?
Yeah, so it's actually two business models are completely different. So again, if you go back history-wise and look at what traditional banking was, or what banking used to be, was a custodial relationship. So you would bring gold, or you would bring some asset. We moved into securities. We have cash accounts. But it used to be that this organization was built to basically maintain and look after these assets, and you would pay a custody fee for the service. And that's a pretty boring but pretty steady model. And somehow we drifted away from that over time, and that was all on a kind of a gradient again. So there's the outrageous stuff that we're seeing in crypto right now, where there's absolutely no title held assets, no real checks and balances, no business model that you would want to trust. And then into something that feels more comfortable and more day-to-day. But even if you dig into some of those relationships, you will probably find that in most cases, certainly for the cash component, And then into the asset component, it varies a little bit about what kind of activities you're doing. But most times you will have a sub-account within a financial corporation that is risk-taking in nature. And when times are good, it doesn't really matter that much. It's convenient. You have you can log on and see your assets and your balance, etc. And it all feels nice and comfortable. And that's maybe fine if.
But you're talking about the U.S. model now, or
I'm talking about most things that are
general?
non-Swiss banking.
Okay.
Because back to your point, there is a specific rule
because in Swiss banking
we
it's
retain
exactly
that core of the custodial
Because
relationship.
custody, and you pay custody fees, and your assets are segregated from the balance sheet of
Exactly.
Of
For
the
me, this
bank.
is the core. When I speak about Swiss banking with anyone, the first conversation is I want people to understand that piece, that Swiss banking maintain that core relationship of being a custodian, and that the contractual agreement is around a title-held ownership of an asset
Right.
that they are custodying for a fee, and that is
Right.
their business model. Yeah. It's also important to say here that there are Swiss banks who veered away from this, and some of them have been in the news of late, tried to become investment banks and do risk-taking activities. The banks we tend to work with are pure custodial banks, maybe with a little bit of asset management, but with no real risk on their balance sheet.
It's really important, and I think I just want to be very clear for viewers the way we look at safety when it comes to custody. We look at it first at a jurisdictional level, then we look at it at a institutional level, so which bank, and there it's very important that for me, Credit Suisse, UBS, we do not work with them. Why do we not
I'll
work
let
with
you
them?
mention it because you're Swiss.
I'll mention it openly. I'm not saying those are bad actors or anything. No,
Sure.
they're important players and pillars of the Swiss economy. However, as an investor, I prefer banks that are not exposed to the obligations of creditors, that are not heavily invested in all kinds of investment banking type activities. And ultimately also that, are not in the business of creating all kinds of very aggressive strategies, investing themselves. And Credit Suisse obviously has been in the news lately, and, obviously something's wrong with their risk management. And so that's that, because institutional level. We prefer institutions, we work with private banks that are not in that kind of investment banking, commercial banking. Most of them don't even have mortgage banking, so it's a completely different business model. And the third layer, which I think is important, is the contractual one.
Yeah.
And so getting that all right is what you're alluding to right now.
Exactly. If you're again, having built generational wealth, you have options in life, and you got to make decisions. And again, if you have options and you're making decisions about the kind of planning structures you want, working with very priced lawyers, doing all of this work, it makes sense that your custodial piece should also match that. And for a lot of people, it's different pieces for different activities. So you may have different assets. We talk about crypto. Maybe people are trading. Maybe you need something that is more functional and fast moving. And maybe it's not so important to have, true contractual ownership of every single asset within that context. But maybe that's the tip of the iceberg. And then you have your larger holdings. And within those, you want to have safety. That's your objective number one.
Absolutely.
When I work with a client, my job is to protect the wealth that has been created through hard work, a little bit of luck here and there, and some smart risk taking. And that is my main job. So at the risk management level for me starts at, have they figured out the planning structures right? If not, let's refer to some of our good friends who we've seen for decades do good work for families. Secondly, what custodians are they using, and how can we use the type of banks you just described, and where ideally they're owned by the same families for hundreds of years, where there's an alignment because they're still private companies to not take crazy risk and not try and mirror, let's say, the Credit Suisse model. Then we are in a good place, because then we can start moving large chunks of long-term assets into those types of custodians. And sure, if the client has risk-taking activities that requires a different type of custodian, that we can also build entities and custody around that specific activity, but it should not be confused with the larger long-term wealth.
The first step is that element of safety, and I think if we look at BFI's history, and you look at the services and the advice we give, which is around cross-border type investing and planning, safety has always been the top priority. A lot of people, I think, when they hear cross-border, they immediately think of tax, efficiency, or they think of global investing, which is important as well. But actually, the top priority, I think, in my view, is really safety. Just getting things into a safe custodial context, and also protecting it from things like frivolous lawsuits and so on. That's really the top priority.
Yeah, I think people ask why Switzerland and why Swiss bank, and I think we just addressed why a Swiss bank. It's simply because it's not because it is Swiss by the nature of it. It is the model that they operate, and the fact that you can still have that type of bank here, which I've looked around the world because I'm not Swiss, and I've looked at different options. And clients sometimes ask me, "Can we find other options, or other things? Is there not a cheaper way to do these things?" And I've looked and I haven't found.
Let's break that down real quick a little bit more. So when it comes to traditional assets, let's say stocks.
Sure.
If I understand you correctly, and I wasn't aware of it to that level, is that I know the Swiss rules. In Switzerland, it's very clear that if you own stocks in your custodial account with the bank, those stocks are not part of the balance sheet of the bank. Those are your assets. You own them, and in the case of an insolvency of the bank, you will continue to own them and get them back. Are you saying that's different in the US in terms of the rules?
What I would say is that there is a gradient of it. So it's very important for each person not to be alarmist and jump out and move. Certainly you can call us up and move everything tomorrow. That's welcome. But I would not suggest that. I would suggest you actually sit down and ask yourself, who is my custodian of the largest parts of my asset portfolio?
Right.
And what kind of contractual agreement, not an accounting-based agreement in the sense that I open up my laptop and I
So you're saying this issue or this potential risk is not necessarily at the regulatory level, it's at the contractual level. So depending on the contract you have with your advisor, which may have an omnibus account, or your bank, you may actually be exposed to the fact if something happens to them, you will not have your assets anymore.
My key message is understand what custodial relationship you do have for your
go into the
part of your
details.
assets. It's not fun, but they send out a lot of pages with a lot of very small writing on them. There's somewhat of a reason for that. Now, what I would be looking for essentially is there's a convenience aspect. So like the idea that we can get on our smartphone now and trade, thousands of different stocks and all kinds of options and whatever you want. For that all to really work, no one really asked that inconvenient question: is it settled every day? Is it held for my account? Is it held with whatever bank I'm working with at some kind of level? The answers to that is probably gray zone, and you want to understand it, at least what it means, and see if you're comfortable with it, because we should be planning for worst case scenarios when we're dealing with that level of wealth over a longer time period. So it makes sense that at least the majority of this wealth should be housed in a place where there's no gray, there's only black and white. I own, it is title held to me, or the entity that I've set up for it. And I think the other side of it is, the other thing you often get when you have a new client is custody fees. Why am I paying custody fees, And, I've been around the world a little bit, and you're going to get what you pay for. And if you're not paying for custody fees, I'm not sure you're getting custody, because these are, for-profit organizations that you tend to work with in this space. So either they're giving it to you for free because they're making money off you in some other way. So either they're trading on the back of you, or they're leveraging the fact that they have a big balance sheet, which then, if they're doing that in some way or format, you're part of that balance sheet is in some way, they have an ability to leverage that. That would make me feel uncomfortable at a starting point.
Absolutely.
So
what you're saying is the devil is in the detail, and you should go and check those details out, especially when it comes to structure, because I agree, the structure side is where you could lose everything.
That's permanent loss. I mean, as people are finding out who had their crypto on FTX right now, and that's really sad, but it is, the reality is that people went for something that was too good to be true. They felt they could get leverage and trade all of these things, very light KYC, no custody fees, often would pay you to keep things on in yield products, etc.